Good afternoon. It's Ben Rubin from UK Column, and welcome to my desk. I was going to say office, but it's not really my office, it's our office. And this is where I indulge my OCD and cover the wall with diagrams and quotes and put things up on the whiteboard, which is actually looking a little bit empty at the moment. That will be much more full over the coming days, as I'm working on something quite significant, which is related to what I'm going to talk about today. But this is a subset of a bigger story. But I'm calling this film Climate Cabal, and actually it might be the first in a series, because the Climate Cabal, this essentially criminal conspiracy to create a single global political and economic structure under the pretext of supposed man-made climate change as this existential crisis that we must all come together and fix, is driving pretty much every area of policy and most of the crazy stuff that we're seeing around us on a daily basis. This push towards net zero and this huge green industrial transition, which really is about consolidation of power and consolidation of wealth, and unlocking a new industrial revolution, a fourth industrial revolution, which will be extraordinarily extractive and damaging for the natural world, but is being sold to us as a way to protect the natural world. Classically, you see this kind of thing all the time, this inversion of meaning, and it's being led out by a international, essentially predator class, these uber capitalists who own and control everything, most notably people like the late David Rockefeller, who absolutely sits at the core of this whole program, or he certainly did do. But the Rockefeller Foundation, which he was the head of, absolutely sits at the core of this whole program. And there's this fantastic quote that he put in his own memoirs, interestingly, which came out in 2002, where he says that some even believe that we, the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. My emphasis there on the slide, right? So that's quite an extraordinary quote, and essentially tells you everything that you need to know about what's happening at the moment. We are pushing towards, or we are being pushed towards, should I say, a one world system, an integrated economic and political structure that will place all power and all wealth into the hands of an international, unelected ruling class who are seeking to embed their position in perpetuity. And climate change is the big lie, the big narrative that is pushing that whole program along. And earlier this year, back at the start of May, I believe it was, I went to an event in London called Innovation Zero. And this is a big old public-private marketplace. So where the politicians and the industry people come together to talk about the implementation of this whole program. And I'm going to get into that in quite some detail. Just going to talk about what I saw, show some clips of that I took on the floor of the exhibition, pull out some quotes from some of the people that I heard speaking there, show you some of the videos that Innovation Zero themselves have actually put out. And this just gives you a great insight into the current status, essentially, of this whole climate change and green industrial revolution that we're currently kind of being artificially funneled into, right? But before I get into that, I also, by the way, I'm going to point out a few other important things that are happening around this as well. So it'll be a big focus on Innovation Zero, but then I'm going to look at some of the other kind of propaganda programs that are running in the background in the UK and internationally, some of the key people and organisations involved in that, so that you can get a sense of how this whole thing is being is being coordinated. But before I get into that, let's do a very brief bit of background, right? So you will not fail to have noticed this issue of climate change. It is ubiquitous. In some sense, it's all we've heard about for the past decade or so, this supposed existential crisis due to carbon emissions and the idea that the world is in a state of boiling. I think, was it Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, says that we now have global boiling. It's not global warming, right? We've got this whole kind of catastrophe narrative, which means we've got to change everything. We've got to give up fundamental rights. We've got to scrap everything that's gone before and bring in a completely new system. And this program towards the development of one world that was described by David Rockefeller there has been going on for a very, very, very long time. Yeah, so there are rich and powerful people and families and groups operating in our society here in the UK and internationally that have been seeking to consolidate wealth and power forever. And we're just getting to the kind of the business end of that, essentially, is what I would say. And it's the significant part of the narrative around this is being driven out of the UN, and which was very heavily backed and supported by the Rockefeller family in a whole number of ways, from its formulation through to the present day, which I won't get into right now because it's not what I'm making the film for, but I can talk about that in a separate discussion. But a lot of it comes from the UN Biosphere Conference, which took place in 1968, which was the first international conference to address the relationship between human activity and the biosphere from a scientific and a policy perspective. And that basically laid the groundwork for this current push towards what they call sustainable development, right? And that's driving the entire global political and economic agenda. And this whole thing has been playing out now for, what is that? Is that nearly 60 years? Is that right? Yes, crikey. Nearly 60 years since the UN Biosphere Conference in 68. Blimey, doesn't time fly? So the UN's absolutely at the heart of this. A lot of that is controlled and coordinated through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which operates essentially under the auspices of the UN, the IPCC. You'll hear that term a lot. Which is a supposedly independent scientific panel who have given the full stamp of approval from the global academy to the official narrative around climate change. And actually the UN actually says explicitly, one of their top people a couple of years ago came out and said, we own the science, which is a ridiculous thing to say. You can't own and control science, right? It defies the definition of the scientific method, right? It doesn't allow for that. But anyway, they're using this these organisations like the IPCC to own and control the global narrative, and that is basically the big driving propaganda push is coming from the UN and these bodies, and it's very much about climate. A lot of this is being driven by non-governmental organisations, in particular the Club of Rome, which interestingly was launched in 1968, was founded in 68, so at the same time as the UN Biosphere Conference. Sure, as Brian would say, just a coincidence, Ben. Probably not a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences anymore, to be honest with you. When you look at how these things kind of hang together, when you look at them when you step back and actually see the coordination between these different component parts of the system, it all looks planned to me. And the Club of Rome, which still exists today, was founded by Aurelio Pecci and Alexander King to promote long-term thinking on what they called the world problématique, a term describing the complex interdependent crises of population growth, resource exhaustion, environmental degradation, industrialisation. And the first meeting of the Club of Rome was held at the Villa Serbelloni, which is a private villa in Bellagio in Italy by Lake Como, which is owned by the Rockefeller Foundation. Right, so Rockefeller get absolutely the fingerprints of that family and the foundation that they backed are all over the climate change agenda, and it has to be understood in the context of that quote that I just gave you a moment ago from David Rockefeller, which is that they are proud of the fact that they're trying to build an integrated one world system. Right now, the Club of Rome has been central to this whole agenda and how it's developed over time. They've published lots of books and reports, one of which I've just drawn a quote from here because I think it's very revealing, right? It's called The First Global Revolution, published in the mid-80s, written by Alexander King and a guy called Bertrand Schneider. And they say in the book that in searching for an enemy to unite us, right, so that's an interesting line to just dwell on for a second. In searching for an enemy to unite us, right? So the idea is that they're trying to unite humanity, the world, against an enemy. We came up with the idea that pollution, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and in their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which demands the solidarity of all peoples. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it's only by changed behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. Yeah. So the enemy to unite us is us. Because apparently we are so damaging to the world that we must be repressed and controlled. And I think that this is an extremely important quote to understand and to dwell on when you think about what we're hearing constantly from the media and from politicians and from the scientific establishment about the way things are going and what needs to be done about it. Absolutely core to this is the Commonwealth of Nations. We talked about the UN, but a big subset of the UN is the Commonwealth, which is the 56 nations from Antigua to Zambia, which essentially are the British Empire. This is a rebrand of the British Empire. The empire ended after the Second World War. We'd already been in some decline for a few decades before that. But the Commonwealth is essentially the British Empire ruled through soft power rather than hard power. I think that's the best way to think about it. And in 1989, they issued the Langkawi Declaration, which was from one of their big Commonwealth heads of government meetings, where they called for a coordinated global effort to combat the greenhouse effect, which may lead to severe climatic changes, and for all of that to be done under the auspices of the UN. Do you remember the greenhouse effect? That was one of the precursors to climate change and global warming, and all these kind of terms essentially ladder up to the same thing, which is that humanity is going to destroy the world unless we drastically change our entire society in a way which just happens to benefit the richest families who've ever lived in the whole of history the most. But we don't talk about that too much. The Commonwealth, I think, crucially, is one of the main mechanisms through which Britain exercises its influence onto the rest of the world, right? Because if Britain came along a lot on its own and said, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, then I think people would be quite suspicious, because we don't have a particularly good reputation on the international stage for being, honest about things, and actually we're running a global empire up until fairly recently. And we use the Commonwealth to manufacture consent to policies that our elites, our ruling class, want to implement internationally. And we use the Commonwealth as a way to turn around to the rest of the world and say, look, we've talked to these brown people. That's not me saying that. That's essentially how they approach this stuff, right? People from the global south and women of colour and all that kind of thing, and therefore you should trust us, right? And they're quite explicit about this, right? So you can see here, he's the now King Charles. Well, he was the king when this picture was taken, right? So this was from 2024 at one of the CHOGM Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings in Samoa. And you can see him there up at the podium delivering his remarks. But then to his right, our left, as we're looking at the picture, that's Baroness Patricia Scotland, who was the Commonwealth Secretary General at the time. And she, in other interviews that I've seen with her, says that the Commonwealth is this petri dish that you can grow almost anything in. You come up with solutions that work not just for the Commonwealth, but for everybody. So they develop policies within the Commonwealth through compliant and perhaps in some instances deeply corrupt politicians who are going to go along with the agenda that is being handed down by the king. And then they use that to influence international policy, particularly in places like the United Nations. The Commonwealth is very, very influential in putting forward this whole idea of sustainable development and sustainable investment, crucially. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't really wise to this. And there's this fantastic quote from a former vice president of Zambia, a guy called Simon Kapwepwe, who I think absolutely had his head screwed on, knew exactly what was happening, right? Where he said, if we don't handle our independence very well, colonizers will come back in the form of investors. And that's exactly what's going on here. So sustainable development, these investment packages in order to bring in new energy systems and whatever else it might be, healthcare or education or digital systems for banking or like whatever it might be, which are being delivered through inward investment from the City of London and other places where international capital coalesces and exerts its influence across the world. That is essentially colonisation. That is how empire now exerts influence over humanity, right? And the Commonwealth and the Brits are absolutely central to this. And most of what is currently happening in terms of, real at the coalface activity, strategically, tactically, how this whole thing is playing out, this global transition is being driven out of the City of London and Westminster, and through our involvement, as I've just described, at international political bodies and places like the World Economic Forum, which is the kind of private sector counterpart to the United Nations. They work very, very closely together, as I'll come back to in a moment. But a lot of the sort of intellectual groundwork for this was developed in the UK, notably through the work of this guy. So this is Lord Nicholas Stern, who was the chief economist to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So top economics guy in the European economic infrastructure. He was then chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. So essentially he was doing things at a European level, and then took that up to the global level with the World Bank and Europe in a similar fashion to how I've just described the role of the Commonwealth is absolutely an incubator for global policy. And they actually view the EU as the kind of the yardstick for how they want international governance to work, which, if you know anything about the EU, is just frankly laughable, because it is just a hideously corrupt and inept organisation in so many different ways. So that's kind of Stern's provenance. And then after the World Bank, he then went to work for Tony Blair in Downing Street, and then they used Britain as the kind of the petri dish, the laboratory for the development of a new economic policy in response to this supposed climate crisis, and that culminated in the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. Interesting choice of title there, Lord Stern. Which came out in October 2006, and that introduced things like carbon pricing. So this is the idea of people being able to trade their carbon emissions, the introduction of carbon taxes, all with the aim of supposedly driving down emissions, but then also, coincidentally, at the same time, creating a new lucrative global marketplace for people to trade in. The report also called for technology innovation, so the development and deployment of low carbon technologies seeded through public investments. This is about using taxpayer money to create private markets so that capital investors can extract enormous profits through this new industrial revolution that we're being ushered towards. He also called for much greater international cooperation and developing these global frameworks for collective action and sustainable development, which is essentially the market in this sense, because he's talking about the economics and the industrial side of the equation. And a lot of this was about how do we prevent climate change from having a negative impact on GDP, because this is what a gross domestic product turnover of the economy, global economy, which is all these people think about. And essentially within this, he's then calling for much tighter regulation at an international level, and the kind of knitting together of these two power structures, the global political and economic power structures, in a manner that David Rockefeller would be very pleased by, right? Because essentially all this stuff is driving towards the same endpoint. He also called for setting targets around the reduction of carbon emissions in the UK economy, but then also internationally keeping carbon levels at a certain level, but below a certain level of presence in the atmosphere. Yeah, so concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, keeping that below a certain level. And then also this idea of adaptation and investing in what they call resilience measures. And that is basically the transformation of our society in order to combat this supposed existential threat presented by climate change, all delivered or presented as a way of protecting the vulnerable. And particularly doing that in developing nations who have been less responsible over time for causing climate change. And that means that we have some kind of duty of care to them, which generally involves loaning them money so that they can buy technology that they don't need from us, right? And that technology just so happens to, certainly the more modern stuff, necessitate the implementation of a kind of global digital surveillance state, which is centrally and algorithmically managed and just so happens to create a multi-trillion-dollar a year marketplace for global industry, right? It's basically how all this stuff actually kind of plays out. Now, so that was delivered. The Stern report was delivered for Blair. It was commissioned by Tony Blair, but then actually the policy was only then properly implemented by Blair's successor, Gordon Brown, who brought in the Climate Change Act in 2008. And that basically embedded pretty much all the recommendations from the Stern Review into UK policy, locked us into these basically inescapable obligations to set caps on emissions, to do these rolling 5-year reviews, to set future targets and to look at progress towards the targets that had been set previously. They've just done the 4th one, actually, which I downloaded a couple of days ago. It's about 550 pages, so I need to find myself a bit of breathing space to go and delve into that, right? But this stuff's absolutely still playing out right now, 20 years down the track. And one of the kind of key developments of the Climate Change Act was the creation of something called the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, which is this independent body, supposedly independent body, tasked with advising the government on carbon budgets, monitoring progress, reporting to Parliament, and then that runs across administrations ultimately, right? Because this was brought in by Brown, but then this is binding on subsequent Conservative governments, whether that's Brown or May or Johnson or Sunak or whoever it might be, and right up to the present day with Keir Starmer, there's been absolutely no deviation from any of this at all. And essentially, we're being ruled by a technocracy, an unelected, technocratic, managerial class who no one voted for, who none of us have any kind of real ability to impact, professionally or politically. But whose wages that we pay, the consequences of whose decisions we have to deal with on a daily basis, and we've got the highest energy prices in Europe, I think actually potentially in the world. We've destroyed our industrial base, and all of this is in order to comply with these kind of arbitrary restrictions that have been handed down by people like Lord Stern and Gordon Brown, and this has infected absolutely everything, right? And it's essentially, it's almost, this is getting into the territory of religious doctrine now, right? So it's extraordinarily difficult for any kind of serious scientist, particularly in any kind of academic position, to push back on this stuff. If you want to get grant funding for your research, then saying anything that runs counter to the establishment narrative around climate change is going to be extremely damaging to that. But there is dissent, enormous amount of dissent, even within bodies like the IPCC, which is really encouraging to see, and actually that is increasing. Science should be allowed to do what science is supposed to do, which is to critically engage with absolutely everything, without fear or fervour, without any kind of censorship, in order to establish what is and isn't true. Like, that's what science is supposed to be doing. And one of the only reasons that the establishment has been able to progress this whole thing is because of, the lockup of the scientific establishment, but also because the media, particularly in this country, has been completely shackled, most notably via the BBC, which is still an extraordinarily dominant voice, or that is changing, who actually issued some internal guidance back in 2017, which starts with the phrase "climate change is happening," with "is" in capitals and in bold in their own document, which essentially sets the tone for the rest of that 4-page piece of guidance which came out, which basically says you aren't really allowed to critique this at all. Introduces this idea of climate deniers. They're a denier. We can't have deniers on, because that would be, scientific. We actually have people who are challenging the hypothesis, but what does the BBC have to do with truth? Not a lot, quite frankly. Now, importantly, this is essentially being delivered through what amounts to global fascism, right? And there's this quote from Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who actually invented fascism, where he said that fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. And if you remember the quote that I read out at the beginning from David Rockefeller, where he says that we're creating a more integrated political and economic structure. Well, the political structure is the state, and the economic structure is the corporate industrial side of things. So that what Rockefeller's calling for, and what is being delivered right now, is technically fascist, right? Really importantly, and that is being driven through the UN, and in particular the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's this fantastic slide from a lady that I've talked about a lot in other reports for UK column called Lisa Witter, who runs something called Apolitical Foundation, and which is a global body operating in 170 countries, run out of the UK and Germany, the kind of co-headquartered between the two countries, who are transforming global governments and retraining and reframing politicians and civil servants and propagandizing local populations. And she actually shows here on this slide that I took from a video that I found of her talking on YouTube about the integration of two main power structures. You have government on the left-hand side, financial markets on the right-hand side, state and market integrating, coming together in order to deliver something that meets the technical definition of fascism. And you can see in the centre there, that is the UN Sustainable Development Goal logo, 17 goals, one of which, I think it's number 13, relates to climate change. There are a bunch of others in there, which I won't get into right now, but climate change is absolutely critical to this. And actually, you can see down the bottom centre right, climate change in bold is one of the major threats, supposed threats, which is basically a crisis narrative that's being used to terrorise the population into accepting this creation of a single world, one world global fascist system that will put all power and wealth into the hands of a completely unaccountable international elite. So this is quite important for people to understand. And then also, it's not just about the government and the state. Things have evolved over time, and really importantly to understand is this idea of what we call trisectoral networks, where the public and the private sectors are integrating with each other in that kind of fascist model that I've just talked about, but they're doing that by manufacturing consent through the influence of what they call civil society organisations. And essentially how that works is the extremely wealthy individuals and families and companies put money into supposedly charitable foundations and civil society organisations in order to manufacture consent for policies that are then implemented by compliant politicians. And when those policies are brought in, they just so happen to create really lucrative new market opportunities for international capital, who then put more money into the civil society organisations to create new laws that are enacted that create more money for them, and the whole thing goes round and round and round and round and round, right? And that's actually embedded into UN practice and has been since 1998 by Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at the time. And this model is ubiquitous, whether it's at a global level or right down into what's happening in your local area. You'll see politicians and business people working with charities, foundations, civil society organisations, NGOs, like there's various different terms for this, in order to create the appearance of essentially some kind of democratic process, or the idea that what they're doing is desirable for the rest of society, when pretty much exclusively it isn't. All right. So with that all in mind, I headed off to Innovation Zero in Kensington, Olympia, West London. I put my commuter backpack on and I headed over on the overground from Walthamstow, where I was staying with a friend, and I joined the rat race again, because I used to be in the rat race and I'm not really now. And I went over to Olympia, which is a really stunningly impressive old Victorian exhibition centre in West London. And I got my lanyard and I entered the exhibition hall, which is really, like I say, it's a beautiful, beautiful Victorian building, which was opened in 1886, I believe it was. certainly in that decade, in the 1880s, as a place to showcase the technologies of the first industrial revolution. That's what it was for. And ultimately to project imperial power out across the British Empire. And essentially what was happening here is the same thing today. It's just that it's the fourth industrial revolution, not the first industrial revolution. And it's not the British Empire, it's the Commonwealth of Nations and then the UN network beyond that, which is basically every country on earth, And Innovation Zero is a crucial dissemination point for new ideas, new technologies, investment opportunities, politicians and civil servants to come together to talk about the creation of this public-private marketplace. And it is public-private, so headline sponsor HSBC, the huge international bank, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, so absolutely got its roots in the British Empire and the East India Company and those kind of early years of imperial domination and resource extraction and wealth creation, absolutely focused on the City of London. So they were a headline sponsor. There are lots of other people sponsoring as well, but they're the headline. And then this was all been done in partnership with UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, which is part of Innovate UK, which is the UK's innovation agency, which is responsible for the introduction of new technologies, new social policies, new medicines. I mean, it's just extraordinary the scope of what UKRI and Innovate UK are into. But this was the collaboration between international capital and the UK government in London as a key kind of focal point for the development of this new market. And this was the agenda, the remit that has been set for Innovation Zero was quite extraordinary. So if you actually go to their website, they talk about what happens on the main stage, and I'll come back to the main stage in a moment, because that's where I spent most of my time looking at the talks there, and I'll give you some insight into who was talking, what they were talking about. But just read this statement. This is off their website, right? The Innovation Zero World main stage sets the strategic direction for the future economy. Yeah, they're setting the strategic direction for the future economy. It brings together governments, global industry, so there's that public-private thing, infrastructure owners and major investors to define how the transition is delivered at national and international scale. The transition towards a completely new political and economic system, the one world system, how that's delivered at a national level here in the UK and internationally, because this is a global program. They then go on to say this is where energy security, industrial growth, infrastructure investment, defence, health and food resilience, climate adaptation and mitigation converge into a single systems conversation. Think about that. That's everything. Energy, industrial growth, it's all industrial growth, all investment in infrastructure, defence, health, food, and then what they call adaptation and mitigation. So this is the total reshaping of how our societies operate, how we live, how we interact with each other. A lot of this is about urbanisation and the creation of these new smart cities and the reduction in rural populations and the transformation of our food systems, how we educate our children, how healthcare is delivered. Everything has been hived up into what they call a single systems conversation, a single integrated systems conversation. And so this is the coalescence of all of that stuff into the one world system as being described by David Rockefeller, which is about creating a new, more closely integrated political and economic structure, right? Now they can't do it on their own, so this is a marketplace, yeah. And this is actually as Marissa Drew from Standard Chartered, one of the people speaking, who's very high up in this whole thing. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. And she said that there's an infinite market opportunity around climate change. An infinite market opportunity. That's how they're talking about this stuff. That's how they're thinking about this stuff. And that involves a lot of people coming together, networking, cutting deals, accessing capital, getting grant funding, a lot of grant funding floating around, so loads of taxpayer money coming into this. And these are the self-proclaimed true believers. These are the people that believe in climate change, see the market opportunity, understand the political implications. They're going to come together and they're going to work out how they're going to coordinate with each other to make this whole thing happen. And I'm going to just show you now. I've got it's about 9 minutes actually. Just a clip of me walking around on the floor, seeing what was going on. So I'm still in Olympia. It really is a very good venue with the light streaming through the roof. But then up there, you see that? Classic. You've got the new development out the back, the extension. It's kind of looming over the bright and open Victorian structure, looking like some kind of Death Star in the background. Classic, terrible piece of development work. So I'm going to have a little wander around and comment on some of the things I can see. It's a really, really unusual mix of companies here, which I'm guessing is done deliberately. It's basically all the different component parts of a market. You chuck them all together, shake them up, put some investors in there, some founders, some people looking for jobs, and then shake it all together, see what comes out the other side. She got biotech, we've got advanced technologies for the architecture, the built environment. You've got the UK National Wealth Fund, which is a really important thing. These public investment vehicles where they're taking taxpayer money and then using that to seed fund markets. You can see here the National Wealth Fund mobilising finance, unlocking growth, driving more than 100 billion of finance to unlock long-term economic growth and accelerate the transition to clean energy. So that's taxpayer money being used to drive an industrial transition, sort of seeding the market, building grid infrastructure. You can see on the visual back there, this is the real kind of hardcore physical infrastructure required to drive the transition. And then we got some really interesting, it's like boiler technology, you know. So it's proper kind of engineering next to HSBC, and then a bunch of pretty big technology companies lurking around as well. So Hitachi's here somewhere, who are, I want to say Japanese, but they might not be. Might be Korean, or might be neither. Might be from Taiwan, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure they're Japanese though. Loads of stuff about data. This is company Climatic with a Q. It's all about data and compliance, building benchmarks into corporate reporting systems so that companies can force themselves to comply with whatever the climate gods tell them needs to happen. UKCEH. Which is all about resilience. Resilience. It's a slightly terrifying word that we're hearing a lot now entering the discussions around climate and energy and the whole of society. And this concept of risk management. Everything's done for the management of risk to ensure that society is resilient. And you think, okay, well, what does that mean? It sounds like we need to do it, because why wouldn't you want your society to be resilient? But actually it's about the imposition of centralised control in whatever form that might take. When you actually listen to what they're saying and what they're recommending. And there's loads of these little workshop things happening around the place. So, not sure I've ever been anywhere where they've got all of these kind of workshop sessions just amplifying out into the main hall, and then you've got the main stage at the back. You can see over there, I'm not sure you can see it in the video, that sign, that thing says main stage, and basically the whole back of the hall is taken up by that, and they're amplifying out into the main space as well. And they've got all these little media hubs for shooting interviews, having conversations with people. You see, this is Energy Voice, which I'm guessing is some trade rag. What else have we got? UKAS, UCAS.com, World of Confidence, Enhancing Global Climate Accountability and the Credibility of Sustainability Actions. Again, this is all reporting, compliance, making sure that you're telling people what you're doing and this is being communicated properly and it's all aligned to shared standards that everyone understands, so that we can all migrate to this new system at the same time, at the same pace, in lockstep, everywhere around the world, not just in the UK, internationally too. OCS Energy Services. Here's Hitachi. Helping governments, cities and companies cut carbon through climate change innovation. They've probably got a big consulting offer wrapped around their technology platforms, but that's interesting. Governments, cities and companies. Cities are absolutely crucial in this. You've got the regions in the house here. You've got Tees Valley up in the northeast, which has got this whole section here. Actually, it's one of the biggest stands in the place. They're calling creating the world's first net zero industrial cluster by 2040 in the Tees Valley. So this is the port facility, the offshore wind, or nearshore wind, I guess. And this looks like it's part of it too. Decarbonisation of industry using nuclear, with a nuclear, there you go, yeah, that's up on Teesside. Another thing up on Teesside. Wilson International. So that is the repurposing of the northeastern industrial heartlands towards this green energy transition. Deep underground laboratory powering net zero technologies, UK research and investment. Some Vela. All those miners still going back underground, are they? Biodiesel from waste. Okay, that sounds like a good idea. So this is really interesting actually. What's going on with Teesside? Might have to have a chat to these people. So I did try and have a chat to those people, but they actually didn't want to talk to me. Not on camera anyway, because their comms guy had gone home, and apparently the guy, I can't remember if it was a politician, he's probably a civil servant I was talking to from Teesside. He wasn't allowed to talk to anybody without having his handler there, which was quite interesting, I thought. And probably because they were worried about someone coming along and criticising what they were doing, which is essentially what I'm up to. And by the way, you have to toe the line with this stuff, right? Because actually, as I said there in that clip a minute ago, they were creating biodiesel from waste. That is a good idea. Actually, that is a good idea. It's probably something that we should be doing. So you've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, right? And actually, there was another really good thing that I saw there, which I've been thinking about for quite some time myself, which is this organisation, Propel and Power Limited, who create tidal turbines. And I've always thought to myself, if we're going to be using the forces of nature to generate electricity, let's say, but we know that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, but the tide always goes in and out, doesn't it? So why aren't we using tidal? And particularly, as I'm standing here today in a city like Plymouth, and actually in a country like the UK, which is, from a tidal perspective, it's let's say it's a tidal superpower because we are an island. And, we're surrounded by ocean. So isn't that quite a good idea? So I like this Propel and Power Limited company. That's really interesting to me. Probably something to explore there. I like that idea of biodiesel from waste. That's probably a good idea. So you do have to be careful not to criticise things that actually could potentially be useful, right? But then, unfortunately, this is all in the context of this very heavily politicised drive towards a global industrial transition, which is primarily about solar, primarily about wind, and then also these highly extractive battery technologies, right? Like which are built using slave labour. Let's be honest, yeah. So the minerals that are required to create these technologies are, the industries that produce them are as extractive and as badly behaved, if not more badly behaved, than the oil industry has ever been. And they're much more poorly regulated. And we know that a lot of what they do is based on slave labour in places like the Congo, for example, right? Let's go and have a look at the main stage. That was just a tiny little slither. Give you a sense of what's going on the floor of the exhibition, some of the types of organisations that are there. That the compliance point is really important, right? So this is all about compliance to technocratically mandated global standards that are cascaded down through the system that all companies are having to comply with. There's nothing normal or organic or natural about any of this. And actually, just one final example, there was this organisation here called Sustainability Unlocked. It created quite a neat little business, but the thing is, unfortunately, the information they're putting into organisations it's not necessary. And actually, a lot of the spokespeople that they've got, so they kind of present themselves as like a TED type organisation, specifically for climate changes. They say here, trusted by the world's most forward-thinking companies. So they've got some big clients, Santander, Airbus, GSK, etc., etc. And what they do is create knowledge and learning systems that are then integrated into the intranet. Yeah, so the kind of digital platform that staff will have access to do their timesheets or submit their expenses or whatever else it is that people do with their intranet these days. They'll actually embed learning modules so that you can equip yourself with good information to mobilise your strategy, protect against regulatory and operational risk. I'm reading off the banner in the centre there, and then that's delivered by what they call world-leading experts, including Mark Carney and who else do I recognise on there? You've got Ronnie Coleman at the bottom there. Ronnie Cohen, sorry, not Coleman. and various others, right? So there's that side of compliance as well, and knowledge and learning and propagandizing the people who work in multinational corporations into going along with the climate narrative, basically, and a whole lot of other stuff besides that, right? So let's just skip on from there. We'll talk about the main stage, the thing that I pointed to in the film that you saw, and this is the big blockbuster showstopper piece of the event. The whole thing was led off on the day by this fella from Mung Investments, who are the Saudi Arabian investment fund behind Innovation Zero. They got a bunch of investments in these event companies, and there was loads of Saudi presence, loads of Saudi investors. They had a big stand, and they're just firing off capital into things that they think have got the potential to deliver a return for them. Obviously, it's what they're there for. It's not about saving the world, believe me. It's about making loads and loads and loads of money. So, there's interesting that this is being run by a Saudi group, but it was led out by this guy who is the chair of the Climate Change Commission, which is that supposedly independent body that was set up as a consequence of the Climate Change Act brought in by Gordon Brown. This is Nigel Topping. And he's a kind of engineer and industrial manager by background. Has run big production operations, factories, that kind of thing. By the sounds of it, what he was talking about, described by the Telegraph as the most powerful man in the country that you've never heard of. And I think that's absolutely true. Right? If you think about like the impact of this whole climate agenda from an industrial, a financial, political, cultural perspective, he's basically right at the summit of that pyramid, preaching to the choir. And actually, he used that term. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but they're trying to shift things a little bit. He's talking about this idea that in previous years they positioned this event as being for true believers, and there definitely was something semi-religious about. And more so in previous years. If you go and look at previous events from Innovation Zero, they're very much like moralizing and presenting this as some kind of great moral crusade to save humanity, when actually it's really not what that's about at all. And also, it's certainly not a good way to motivate capital, because they don't care about that. They care about making money. As he got into, right, and because he's describing this as a market. There is an inevitability to all of this, saying that this transition is only going to accelerate. The only route to energy security is through electrification, presenting lots of statistics around this idea that floods and fires and natural disasters are increasing, when actually it's very easy to find information which says that that's not the case at all. Loads of charts about carbon reduction, progress made so far, projections about corporate profits, the admission that it's easier to unlock capital investment when there's a growth story. So essentially, he's there to deliver a growth story so that capital flows into this marketplace. And he even uses the phrase, there are fortunes to be made, which is a bit like the Marissa Drew quote I just said a minute ago, where she says this is an infinite market opportunity. Patrick Topping saying there are fortunes to be made here, right? Very much delivering that message. And then also, after he was speaking, I did hear this lady, Nicola Ranger, from the Earth Capital Nexus at the London School of Economics. The LSE, by the way, is absolutely central to this, with the Grantham Institute, which is where Lord Stern is now, and where Nicholas Stern is at the LSE, amongst other places. So this lady was talking about the fact that global banking regulation is going to be used as inspiration for the governance of natural systems, which is quite extraordinary, actually. It's like, what has global banking regulation got to do with the governance of natural systems, and why do natural systems need to be governed in the first place? So much stuff in here that's just, it really just does not make any sense unless you understand it as a big push to create huge, unprecedented global marketplaces to deliver an industrial revolution that is going to create huge amounts of wealth, unbelievable amounts of wealth for a very tiny, discrete group. So that was, the kind of pretext to the context of the day. The whole thing was compared day one by this lady, Samira Ahmed. You can see on the left-hand side there, former Channel 4 and BBC journalist. She opened up by saying that, the question is not whether this transition happens, but how and who benefits. Yeah. So again, this inevitability, and then this question of who benefits, and basically it's the people in the room at Innovation Zero that want to benefit, and a lot of them will potentially benefit if this thing happens. Although I don't think it's going to roll out in the way that they think it is. It's also used this term that physics doesn't care about election cycles. Which is interesting. This again just feeds into this. So this is sort of basically out of the hands of politicians, and the scientists and the technocrats are in charge, and they've set the direction of travel. And it doesn't matter what you say, Mr. Politician. This is all going ahead, whether you like it or not. This was a fascinating panel, actually. There's some big hitters here. So Laura Sands, CBE, the lady in the red jacket. She's a former Tory MP. She's now chair of the government's Energy Data Task Force, chair of something called the Green Alliance, chair of the British Standards Institute's BSI, their advisory board on net zero. So again, that's British standards, metrics, all about compliance, setting templates for how industries are structured, like right down to the absolute nth detail of how organisations have to operate. She basically came up and said that the technocratic argument has failed, because essentially they have failed to sell this agenda to the mass population. And she was basically saying, we've got to go after hearts and minds. You can't just have this technocratic argument, which was quite funny because it was very clearly a pointed dig at the chap to her left in the picture as we're looking at here, who is Lord Turner, Adair Turner. Who has previously very famously said, I am a technocrat. So he's very happy and proud to be a technocrat. And she's saying the technocratic argument has failed. Turner's a fascinating creature. So he was actually the first chair of the Climate Change Commission from 2008 to 2012. He's now chair of what's called the Energy Transitions Commission, which is a really important organisation, again, right at the top of the pyramid. And that is convened and supported by something called Systemic, which is part of where Lord Stern directs his time and attention and extracts his influence and wealth from. Turner was he's a very sort of old-fashioned kind of creature, and he was really upset because. He said that social media is undermining the coherence of public debate, which is to say that we've got all these troublesome people saying things that don't align with our version of reality and truth, and this is really terribly difficult and bothersome because we should just be able to tell people exactly what to do, which is the mindset that you're dealing with here. And he strikes me as one of these people that he only understands reality via surveys. So he's constantly talking about data. Well, we have data on this and data on that. And what he means is public opinion surveys, because they don't actually know how to kind of talk to anybody. They don't know any real people. Then on the right hand side of the stage there, you've got Mehdi Kobans. This is the political side of the equation, and I've reported on Koban a lot before. He was the founder of this organisation called My Life My Say, MLMS, which is a supposed youth charity, which is about increasing youth engagement in the political process. They were the people behind the Votes at 16 programme, and they just so happen to be rather lavishly supported and backed by the Tony Blair Institute and the Rothschild family, and they work out of an MI6 facility in East London, and I could go on and on and on about them. And he's definitely being groomed as a sort of potential future leader of the left, potentially even a future leader of the country, to be honest with you, at some point in the future. I'm sure he thinks that. And he's one of Sadiq Khan's top lieutenants. He's deputy mayor for sustainability and the environment. And basically he's there building this kind of neo-Marxist, eco-populist narrative to generate democratic consensus around the industrial transition that people like Adair Turner want to drive humanity into. Was very much making this a sort of us and them thing. So he would say, Trump and Farage, they don't want sustainability, and constantly talking up Sadiq Khan in this really obsequious way about his historic, unprecedented third term for the mayor of London, and yada yada yada. So anyway, that was a fascinating panel. We then had these ladies. I won't go into all of them, but you focus on Emily Shukba, who's the one immediately to the right of Samira Ahmed, who's on the left-hand side with the microphone. So the lady immediately to her right, that's Emily Shukba, who, amongst other things, is a trustee on the advisory board of the Quadrature Climate Foundation, which is a City of London-based investment fund. It's like a perpetual profit-making machine that is just pumping tens, hundreds of millions of dollars into the kind of climate agenda, ostensibly for the benefit of the whole of humanity, but they also just happen to be making quite a lot of money on the other side of that too. And actually, I've got a little video clip here of Emily Shukba, who said when she was on stage that she's passionate about the climate crisis.
So as a country, we have a clean energy superpower mission, and that has two components of it. One is clean power by 2030, and the other is net zero by 2050. And that mission is really channeling our efforts to create the industries of the future, to create the jobs of the future, and in doing so, generate both energy security, but also help tackle the climate crisis. So we know that to really stimulate the innovation ecosystem for driving clean technologies, we need to have three things. We need to have policy certainty, we need to have a pipeline of innovations, and we need to have that collaboration between the public sector and the private sector across a range of things, including finance. What we're doing is later this year, as the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, we're going to be launching our Clean Tech Innovation Challenges, which are exactly to help support that ecosystem across all three of those different dimensions to accelerate those solutions that are going to deliver real world impacts.
Yeah, so public-private partnership, and she kind of alluded there to just these huge slugs of money. So I showed the National Wealth Fund in that original video of me walking around on the on the exhibition floor. But there's just an extraordinary amount of taxpayer money just flooding into this space at the moment in order to create an artificial marketplace. Yeah, and what's really important to understand is that the public money is not going to extract. Taxpayers aren't going to get a huge benefit from this. Yeah, like the real profit is going to go to international capital. It's just the public money is used to essentially show commitment from the government towards a particular market structure, so that the capital investors have confidence that the regulatory environment is going to stay consistent. As she said, right, we want policy certainty, and one of the ways that they can give capital certainty or confidence in the fact that there is certainty around policy is by putting a load of taxpayer money into the marketplace to seed fund it, right? And I've got another clip here of the head of another one of these organisations, of which there are many organisations like this inside the British government. And here's another one, the British Business Bank.
Louis, what is the British Business Bank doing in the space of green innovation?
Well, there are three things we're doing. The first is we're providing SMEs with the information they need to help decarbonise their operations, because the lack of information is a big issue here. getting companies going. Second thing we're doing is we're helping to finance that transition for small businesses to cleaner energy, whether it's in vehicle fleets going electric or whether it's retrofitting their buildings to use less energy. And then the third thing we're doing is we're investing in innovative businesses developing the solutions that will develop a low carbon economy.
And we saw the British Business Bank's budget being increased by 2/3 at last year's spending review. How is that money going to flow out into the economy?
Well, you're absolutely right. We got a big increase in the financial capacity. 4 billion of that is going to be focused on the 8 industrial strategy sectors, of which clean energy is one. But actually, sustainability is something that runs right through all of our investment activities. But we're going to be increasing the amount of money we're investing in the UK economy by 2/3, and we're going to be making sure that money is going all around the UK, not just into London and the South East. So it'll be a material change.
And so what does that actually look like in terms of tangible impact once you've deployed that money?
Yeah. So what it looks like is we're likely over the next 5 years to support about 180,000 new businesses. We're going to help create 370,000 new jobs. And we're going to be making sure that the regions get a really good slug of this, backing innovative companies. So it'll have a big impact. £68 billion of growth for the economy is what we're aiming to generate.
Helping SMEs to decarbonise. So it's basically getting small businesses to engage in this industrial transition, which they probably wouldn't do without the influence of organisations like this. Financing that through loans, basically. So this is taking taxpayer money and then giving it back to taxpayers probably at a rate of interest. There'll be some grants in there as well, right? But it's the British Business Bank. This is an extraordinary distortion of what the state is and is supposed to be doing. Investing in new businesses. What is the government doing investing in new businesses in order to create a new market? It's none of their business, right? So this idea that we are investing in the UK economy. You're not investing in the UK economy. The only reason that you have any money in the first place is because you've taken it from taxpayers. You can't then give it back to taxpayers and say, oh, look at us, we're investing in you. Well, why didn't you just not tax us in the first place? That would have been a good idea. He's going to create 180,000 new businesses, 370,000 new jobs. Ludicrous. Completely ludicrous. And then another an important organisation with all this is Innovate UK, who are UK Research and Investment, UKRI, who are one of the main people, as I spoke about earlier, who are helping to operate this event, one of the key partners. They're part of Innovate UK, and we're going to just have a little listen now to one of their, I think he's their investment chief, talking about what they're up to.
So Innovate UK exists to fund frontier technologies that come out of the business population. So taking those great ideas that we see in academia and taking them into market and commercialisation. We do that through a range of things. So we have grants, which we're traditionally known for, but we also provide aligned investment alongside equity capital, and we provide debt finance as well as part of our broad offer, alongside expertise, access to infrastructure in the market. So one of the big challenges, of course, is that when you bring any novel technology to market, what you really are doing is exposing yourself to risk of unknown opportunities and unknown markets. Innovate UK exists to sit in that space, to take that risk, to prove out the technology and to bring expertise to bear on that, so we make people market ready for the next stage of growth. So Innovate UK assesses the quality of the innovation. We look at the quality of the team behind it, and then we work with companies to make sure they have access to supply chains and capital that helps them get over those inflection points to prove out that their technology works. That's sort of what we're here for.
So you've got the state operating like a financial services organisation, taking risks with taxpayer money in order to scale new businesses and new technologies. It's not what the government's for. It's not what it's supposed to be doing. And it's extraordinary, this kind of this blurring of the lines between government and finance and industry into this essentially this integrated one world system, right? Which is what we're talking about here. So, and as I said, that's just two. So what we looked at: National Wealth Fund, British Business Bank, Innovate UK. There are umpteen of these things across the government. And actually, that guy there, Scott O'Brien, was saying when he was on one of the panels that he was having a conversation with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, where essentially that they want to create a single integrated proposition to businesses and people looking for grant funding, where there's essentially no wrong front door. Wherever you go into the government in looking for money, they'll be able to pass you around to the right person in order to get you the grant funding or the loans or whatnot that you need. Nothing, government shouldn't be anywhere near this. Yeah, it's absolutely crazy that it's even got to this point, to be honest with you. Where to now? So let's just have a quick look at this panel. So this is the second day was run by this chap, Dave Schuckman, who's the former BBC science editor. He's now involved with the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, again, where I said a lot of this stuff is being coordinated from. Interesting panel. There's a guy from the fire service there on the right-hand side who was basically, again, talking about this cross-sector collaboration in order to improve resilience across society, right? So this is very much getting into the emergency services, the security services. There are probably some military people there, I'd imagine. It's certainly on the agenda as set out by Innovation Zero itself. But the interesting lady there was Emma Howard-Boyd, CBE, who's just sitting next to Schuckman, centre-left there with the flowery dress on, who was talking about this idea that we want to target 0 deaths from climate change. 0 deaths. How does that even happen? Like, you can't target 0 deaths, and how are you even attributing any deaths to climate change, right? And if you're going to try and aim for 0 deaths, what are you going to end up doing in your society in order to try to deliver that? It's very much like zero COVID. We must reach 0 COVID, but in order to get to 0 COVID, we have to lock down the whole of our society and destroy everyone's lives in pursuit of trying to protect their lives. You know, it's just complete lunacy. Here's a little clip of her talking.
Right now, we have literally decades ahead of us where we're going to see an increasing amount of climate shocks. So it's important in every decision we make, from an investment perspective, from a personal perspective, that we're thinking about building in resilience to the heat waves, the floods, the droughts that we know we're going to see, rather than locking in that vulnerability.
Decades of climate shocks and heat waves and floods and droughts. We've got to change the whole of society to stop this from happening. Everything's going to be terrible, right? This is the kind of tone that we're getting, particularly, I'll be honest with you, from the sort of the female delegation, and this is very heavily being led out by female voices, female leaders, who have kind of. The way I see it is this sort of weaponization of the maternal instinct, the protective instincts. We've got to wrap everything up in cotton wool and stop people from hurting themselves because the world is scary and terrible and awful. And actually, you know, it's that kind of mentality that's been harnessed by the establishment in order to drive this whole thing forward. I'll be honest with you, and actually I'll come back to her in a moment. Because she's part of an international network of female leaders who are very much at the forefront of all of this. Another lady of extraordinary influence, this lady, Lucy Yu, very, very, very influential, very smart. Been following her for quite some time. She's the CEO of something called the Centre for Net Zero, which is part of Octopus Energy Group. Octopus, hugely important, UK state-backed, British company, not massively backed by the state, so it's a private company, but they do have some investment from the British government. Essentially makes them a national champion, but very much run out of the city, and very successful in the UK, expanding internationally. They've got a whole bunch of businesses under that Octopus umbrella. Not least the one called Kraken, which essentially is the operating system for the new digital energy grid. And I'm very concerned about that organisation, right? The idea that you're going to put control of the whole of our energy grid and also other countries onto this single digital platform controlled by the people that control it, I think is an extraordinarily dangerous thing for us to be doing. You want to talk about risk. Yeah, don't do that, right? And Lucy Yu's involved with Octopus. She's in non-exec of something called E3G, which is run by a former Blair guy, and this is all backed by Chatham House and lots of other organisations that are kind of operating in this space. Lucy Yu is also an advisor to Tony Blair Institute. She's the chair of the Wikipedia Foundation in the UK as well, so she's very much involved in that control over what you can see and hear and what is and isn't true. And I'll tell you now, it was fascinating to see her in person because she was extraordinarily arrogant, unbelievably arrogant, very clever, great, but the tone and the attitude was just extraordinary. And her boss was also there, who's Greg Jackson, who's the CEO of Octopus Energy, and I've got a little clip of him, which we'll listen to now.
I think we're at a pivotal point in energy, frankly. You've got the fossil fuel industry emboldened by, the US has called to drill, baby, drill. And at the same time, particularly coming from Asia, we've got an astonishing pace of electrification. Everything from electric vehicles to solar panels, driving down the cost of getting from A to B, heating and cooling homes, and running industry. The amazing thing at Innovation Zero is, 90% of the online news coverage of the energy transition is negative, and yet 2/3 of the public sentiment is still positive. And that's why here at Innovation Zero, it is absolutely buzzing with people who know what the future looks like.
Yeah, Greg Jackson, CEO of Octopus. I'll tell you what, he was actually more impressive in person than I thought he was going to be. There's something about the way he talks when he's on video. He just seems incredibly disingenuous and almost like it's scripted. And actually, I think I said when I covered this event briefly on the news last year that I thought he was reading from a script. Actually, he was pretty good on his feet. He was on a panel, and I was quite impressed. But I don't agree with anything that he's doing professionally. I don't think we need this Octopus thing. Definitely don't think that Kraken is good, particularly not that new guy that he got in to run it, the old IDF operative. That's what he looks like to me. So anyway, these are some of the personalities, some of the individuals, and you kind of get a sense of what they're talking about. So that's on the market side of it. And then so a few key points about actually, I'll just show you one particularly important civil servant, right? So basically the top level, the top guy in terms of the energy transition in the UK is Chris Stark, CBE, who is the second from the left on the image here on this panel, who's the head of mission control for Energy 2030, appointed to that position by Ed Miliband. He is the man pulling the strings, calling the shots for the energy transition in the UK, doing all of the central planning for the new grid. And he actually even described it as my clean power system. My clean power system, Mr. Stark. Crikey. That was a bit arrogant. And also he described his clean power system as, in terms of the way that we use it, would be that there would be a signal given from the centre of the power system which would tell us when we're allowed to use energy, or when it would be cheaper to use energy, or when it would be most appropriate for us to do things in our home. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't want to do that. If I want to put the washing on, I want to put the washing on. I don't want to wait until 4 o'clock in the morning when you've told me that it's most appropriate to do so, or some digital signal gets sent down which allows me to turn on my smart washing machine. The whole thing's ludicrous, completely ludicrous. One of the things he did acknowledge, which I thought was quite interesting, was that we are going to need oil and gas. And actually, we're going to need those, even within the transition plans, we're going to need those up until 2050, which then does beg the question, why on earth are we shutting down our own oil fields? Yeah, we should be exploiting those for as long as possible, and our coal fields, quite frankly. And he drew my attention to something called the Strategic Spatial Energy Planning process, which he called the most important thing happening in the UK right now. So this is what it is: strategic spatial energy planning. I'll put a little video clip. I'll put links to all of this stuff, by the way, so you can go and watch it yourselves. Also, crucially, Mr. Stark is, as well as being having a CBE and being head of mission control of Energy 2030, he's also part of the leadership group for this thing, which is called Murmur, which is described as arts leadership for the crisis of our times. From their website, Murmur was created to harness the extraordinary cultural power of music and the visual arts to take on the most existential threat of our time, climate breakdown. This is a really important organisation. Yeah, this is how they are running the propaganda to take the hearts and minds of particularly of the young people to be influenced by their favourite pop stars and musicians, and to kind of own and control that side of the conversation, right? So Stark is running that. He's also on the board of the V&A Dundee, I think it's Dundee, where they've just opened a new Victoria and Albert Museum. And actually that kind of coalescence between politics and industry, which is Stark's day job, and then culture is absolutely crucial, right? Because without getting particularly the youth on board with this, then the whole agenda is going to come to a grinding halt. And so I'll do a much deeper exploration of Murmur at some point in the not too distant future. And then finally, just to wrap up on what I saw at the show, I want to just draw attention to this guy. This is Paul Dickinson hosting a panel on the left-hand side of the stage there alongside Patrick Topping. And then there was another lady called Rhianne Mary Thomas, who I'm pretty sure is from HSBC, so a big investor. And this is where Nigel Topping came out and talked about the idea that there are fortunes to be made here, and actually admitted that they'd spent a lot of time meeting with sustainability officers in banks and other corporations and having lovely meetings, and then nothing ever happening. And then they realised that in order to make things happen, you've got to go to the banks with an opportunity to make profit. And they talked about this idea of green bonds in order to unlock capital. And a bond is a debt-based instrument, which means basically borrowing billions, trillions in order to buy these new technologies, which are basically completely unnecessary in large part, but are going to indebt us and future generations so that capital investors can make trillions of profit. It's basically what these people are promoting. Mr. Topping there, Nigel Topping, Mr. Dickinson, he's a big spokesperson for the whole climate agenda. He's a co-host of this thing called the Outrage and Optimism podcast. He was a founder of something called the Climate Disclosure Project, CDP, which again is just in one of these compliance operations. Like, you have to tell us what you're doing and you have to comply to international standards, and it's just a way of forcing the market into doing what these people want it to do. He in a previous, not on stage here, but in a previous piece of communication from Outrage and Optimism, they had the quote that no one should have the rights to the algorithmic promotion of their climate denial, which basically says if you disagree with us, then you shouldn't be able to share your information on social media. I mean, these people are extremely censorious, basically dictatorial, right? And he wants to unlock an industrial revolution. He actually used that term. We did one industrial revolution. How do we do this one? That's what they're really pushing towards. And then also, crucially, Paul Dickinson says that there was a strong coordinated government action in response to COVID. When will we see a similar approach to the climate crisis? So they want a COVID-style, fully coordinated political and an industrial push to force us into compliance with the agenda that these people have set out for us. Yeah, because we're not doing it quick enough for them. And, as smooth and as charming as Mr. Dickinson's public persona is, actually, he's just a nasty little dictator at heart. quite frankly. And actually, I will draw your attention to a few other organisations which are really important in terms of context, what's going on around this. That kind of coalescence between the approach towards COVID propaganda and climate propaganda was crystallised in this organisation, the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy, which essentially was an international body set up in, I think it was 2021 or 22, where they looked at how the lessons learned from COVID and how they could be applied to climate explicitly. Yeah. So how to harness global policy and media in particular narratives in order to coerce and manipulate populations into compliance with totalitarian outcomes. Yeah. And I'll do a much deeper dive on that organisation, but you should just be aware of it. And then just finally, to wrap up, a few other organisations that you should be aware of. The first one is this one. So this image is Emma Howard Boyd, who I spoke about earlier. You can just see on her lapel there on the left-hand side, that's a dandelion. So she is a dandelion. Dandelion is a global network of female leaders who are pushing forward the climate agenda beyond national boundaries without any respect for national political systems, the rest of society. Like, they're just going ahead and pushing this whole thing forward from behind the scenes in a very deceptive and frankly dishonest way, but all, of course, for the common good. And then in similar fashion, you've got this thing, which I've spoken about a lot on the news. I've spoken about the dandelions on the news as well. I'll put links to previous reports. You can go and find out more about them. But this organisation, National Emergency Briefing, which is in train right now. So it launched in November last year. It's being pushed ahead by Chris Packham, another CBE, commander of the British Empire, right? So we talked about the British Empire earlier. That's what's behind a lot of this, which presents itself as this kind of organic program that's being pushed forward by cash-strapped NGOs and people who just want the best for the country, and those poor climate scientists who just aren't getting enough support at the moment. But actually, in reality, it's got loads of institutional backing. And not least through organisations like the Climate Reality Project, which you can see at the bottom of this slide on the right-hand side, bottom centre with the green bit in the logo, which is Al Gore, right? And it's been set up with money that he's made from his extraordinary investments in climate technologies. If you dig into it, Al Gore was involved in the stranded assets program, working alongside the Rothschild family, which I talked about with Brian recently when we talked about the escape key essays. So a lot of this is actually linked right up into the top tiers of international finance, what Jeffrey Epstein was doing with the Gates Foundation, and actually it's very, very murky territory that we're getting into here, and this is basically what sits behind the whole climate agenda. London is absolutely the epicenter, so I'm sitting here on the 18th of June. Coming up next week, we've got London Climate Action Week, which is a really important focal point for the development of these policies. The NGO territory, you should know about this. This is the Funder Commitment on Climate Change, which is led by the Association of Charitable Foundations, where they've got 133 charities and foundations in the UK, representing 40% of grant funding across the UK to sign up to this climate agenda. So this is how control is being exerted over the charity sector. And then finally, I'll just draw your attention to Clintel, who is a fantastic organisation who've been pushing back on the climate narrative, talking about the fact that even many of the top scientists, including Nobel Prize winners and various other top tier people in academia, have said that there isn't a climate crisis. And actually, this whole thing is a complete scam. And I've got to say that I would completely agree. So anyway, thanks for watching. That was Innovation Zero and a bit of a run through of my view on the climate crisis, supposed crisis, and a bunch of the key players and things that are going on in the UK here and internationally from a political perspective, from a financial perspective, And no doubt there'll be much more to talk about this in future. But for now, thanks for watching. Take care. See you later.